All right, kiddos, we are in chapter 12, section 1, and we are going to be looking at the rise of what's called absolutism, absolute monarchies, and this is what's going to kind of introduce us, lay the groundwork for the revolutions that we've talked about, okay? So just like I've told you in class, make sure you have your guided notes up. We're going to cover a lot of those topics, and then once you complete that, you'll turn that in for points. It'll be one of the few times that you have notes that you can turn in for points, so make sure you utilize this, okay? So we're going to start with, like I said, laying the groundwork for the absolute monarchies, what they are, that type of thing. Here are your guys' learning objectives for this. We're not really going to talk much about Spain. We're going to focus mostly on France. All right, so during the Renaissance and Reformation, European rulers really continued to centralize power at the expense of their nobles and their clergy. As wars of religion raged in many European lands, monarchs battled to impose royal law and restore order in their kingdoms. This usually meant raises taxes and stuff like that. And so we're going to talk about a couple terms first. So like, what is absolute power? All of those things. If your guided question for this unit is how much power should the government have? So you're going to kind of start forming your ideas here. So you have some powerful states and rulers. So we're going to start with the idea of absolutism. Absolutism is the political doctrine where a single ruler has unlimited power. They can do literally whatever they want and nobody can check them. Okay, so if you have a good king, a lot of good things can happen. They can get a lot of positive things done. But if you have a corrupt ruler, which we've seen in history, it can be very detrimental very quickly. And so this leads us to what an absolute monarchy is. So we've talked about a constitutional monarchy a little bit, the idea of a monarchy, but this is an absolute monarchy. This basically means complete control over the government and the lives of its people. They do not have to answer to anybody. They could simply jail, kill, execute, tax, do whatever they want, and nobody can tell them otherwise. And so this idea started to raise for a couple of reasons that we're about to talk about. And one of the reasons why it came to the forefront is because of the idea of divine right, or the divine right theory. And the divine right was justification for these rulers for being in charge. And so it was the authority to rule, or their authority to rule, came directly from God. So they used the God aspect, which was still very important, even after the Reformation and Luther and Calvin all them split. God was very important. They used that to convince and justify to people, this is why I have the authority that I do. Okay, so make sure you understand those three terms. Now, causes of the Age of Absolutism, so causes of absolute government. So you had a couple things take place. We have talked about the Crusades and other conflicts. This was in really what we saw with the Reformation, so religious and territorial conflicts. The peasant revolt during the Reformation that you saw with Luther, or after Luther. All of these things had to be put down, which you need money and military support to do that. And so because of these conflicts, there was a lot of paranoia of our country's going to fall, our area is going to fall, because they saw so much conflict take place. And so they started really consolidating their power because of that. They wanted to take as much power for themselves and rule with an iron fist. The second point was the growth of militaries and the military technology. Whenever gunpowder, cannons, and things like that were introduced, no longer could you hide behind a castle wall. You couldn't be on the defense. So these kings, with those heavy taxes, which is number 3, started putting money back into their militaries to have massive, and I mean massive, standing armies. Great Britain focused on their navy because they were an island. France focused on having a massive army, and that's going to come into play here and later on when we talk about Napoleon. So because of the growth of militaries, they had so much power because the militaries would do simply whatever the king said because he was the one paying them. And then those heavy taxes paid for the militaries to be in charge, but also kept peasants poor and not really focused on how oppressive the government is, but focused on just trying to get something to eat. And so these three things are the reasons why this Age of Absolutism rose during this time. And so we're going to skip through quite a bit. I'm not really going to talk about Spain too much. We're going to focus more on, if you see France right there, we're going to kind of focus more in that French area. And we're going to start with Louis the 14th. And we're going to discuss kind of the effects of him, because he's really going to lay this foundation for his, I believe, his grandson being executed, like we talked about. So soon after Louis the 14th became king, disorder again swept in France. In an uprising called the Fronde, nobles, merchants, peasants, and the urban poor each rebelled in order to protest royal power and to preserve their own power. On one occasion, rioters drove the boy king from his palace. And because of this experience of him being driven from his palace, he decided he was never going to do that again. He was never going to feel that way again. And so he comes back with a pretty important slogan, okay? This pretty important slogan was, he came back and said, "I am the state." And if you think about that message, that is powerful. He's basically saying that he is in charge now. He is everything. Like his grandfather, Philip II of Spain, he firmly believed in the divine right rule, which we talked about. He took the sun as a symbol for his absolute power. He said, just as the sun stands at the center of the solar system, he argued, so the Sun King stands in the center of the nation. Louis is quoted in saying, "I am the state." During his reign, Louis did not once call a meeting of what was the Estates General, which we will talk about. It was a medieval assembly of the social classes, and he simply made everything his. And so he centralizes power. He spent many hours each day attending to government affairs. To strengthen the state, he followed policies of a guy named Richelieu, and expanded bureaucracy to appointed attendants, which were royal officials who collected taxes, recruited soldiers, and carried out policies. So these were basically like people like police enforcing these things. The king often appointed wealthy middle-class men to government jobs, and because of this, it allowed these middle-class people to have influence and be loyal to the king. So he was finding ways to make sure he had power. Under Louis XIV, the French army became the strongest in Europe. The state paid, fed, trained, and supplied up to 300,000 soldiers. Louis used the highly disciplined army to enforce his policies at home and abroad. Now, then you have all this, but then you got to strengthen the economy to pay for these things. And so the French economy grew under the king's brilliant finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Colbert had new lands cleared for farming, encouraged mining and other basic industries, and built up luxury trades such as lace making. To protect French manufacturers, Colbert put high tariffs on imported goods. So he's figuring out ways to really make sure that France was on top here. Okay, so Jean-Baptiste Colbert was an important figure here. The great graph that shows you exactly what he did to strengthen and grow the absolute monarchy, having absolute power. So followed Richelieu's policies, spent many hours a day working on government affairs, expanded the bureaucracy, not democracy, that didn't happen, appointed intendants, appointed wealthy class people, and then grew the French army. Now, we're going to talk about one last thing, and then we'll wrap up today. So in the countryside near Paris, Louis XIV turned a royal hunting lodge into an immense palace of Versailles. There, he presided over both his court and the government. Versailles became the perfect symbol of the power of the Sun King. I highly suggest looking up this palace because it is absolutely magnificent. It's still there today. You can still visit it, and it is breathtaking. I would make sure you look that up on your own. And so because of this, he held these elaborate court ceremonies at Versailles. Louis perfected elaborate ceremonies. He emphasized his own importance. Each day began with the king's bedroom ritual known as the levee, or rising. High-ranking officials competed for the honor of holding the royal wash basin or handing the king the diamond-buckled shoes. At night, the ceremony was repeated in reverse. Wives of the nobles vied to serve women of the royal family. And really what he did is he perfected the idea of powerful people being at his beck and call. And think about what that does for him. He's able to convince people through pay, through whatever, to basically wait on him hand and foot. These aren't servants. These are other nobles in France who are doing this. And so he's able to get them to not focus on the menial tasks they're doing, but give them a reason to do those things for him. So it was really an amazing tool of power that he was able to put over these nobles, because the nobles were less worried about carrying out their own agenda. They're worried about, how do I make the king happy? And he was very, very good at tricking them to do that. And then this is where you see a flowering of French culture. The king and his court supported what was called a splendid century of the arts. The king sponsored musical entertainments and commissioned plays for the best writers. The age of Louis XIV came to known as the classical age of French drama. So you see, if somebody studies theater, this is a moment where this was really powerful, and you see this take place. Here is just one room of many, called the Hall of Mirrors. It's one of the most famous rooms in the Versailles Palace. And this was designed to just simply make people awe at what he was able to accomplish. Now, Louis XIV rules for 72 years, which is an amazing amount of time. Ruling for 72 years, not living, but ruling for 72 years, far longer than any other monarch. During that time, French culture, manners, and customs set the standard for European taste. The Sun King made France the strongest state in Europe in both foreign and domestic affairs. However, many of policies were costly failures. And so you did have some costly wars take place. He poured vast resources into wars, which meant to expand French borders. However, the rival rulers' forces to check these ambitions, they were able to do that. Led by the Dutch or the English, the alliances fought to maintain what's called a balance of power. The goal was to maintain a distribution of military and economic power to prevent any one country from dominating Europe. That was the idea. But you had a couple wars take place, like the War of Spanish Succession, things like that really hurt. And then you have the Huguenots facing persecution. Now, this was a costly mistake for him. Perhaps Louis's most costly mistake was his treatment of the Huguenots. Louis saw the Protestant minority as a threat to religious and political unity. In 1685, he revoked or withdrew what was called the Edict of Nantes, which that was simply meant that was what kept them from being persecuted religiously. Facing renewed persecution, more than 100,000 Huguenots fled France. They settled mainly in England and the Netherlands, Germany, Poland, even the Americas. The issue with that is that they were among the hardest working and really the most prosperous or some of the most wealthy of Louis' subjects. And so he lost this major group of people that really held up the economy. And so you saw that loss really was a blow to the economy and really hurt France as we get to Louis XVI. All right, guys, that is it for notes. If you have any questions, make sure you reach out. If you're missing any answers, look over the link that I provided for you on your guided notes, or make sure you